It was a warm evening in late spring, when Rosa finally pulled her car into the familiar parking lot near the park. The park was her sanctuary, her little corner of peace amidst the chaos of life. Pregnant with her first child, Rosa had grown used to driving, not because she was too lazy to walk, but because the pregnancy left her exhausted easily. The doctor had recommended short walks, but she had learned to pace herself, using her car as a place to sit and catch her breath, before heading out to meet her friends, or enjoy a quiet moment in nature. Tonight, as usual, Rosa parked her sleek, silver sedan near the old oak tree. She had arrived just before sunset, and the air was still warm. The kind of warmth that made the park feel like a friendly embrace. She reached for the door handle, planning to step out and stretch her legs. But before she could move, a sudden voice cut through the evening air. "Whose car is this?" The tone was sharp and accusatory, the words heavy with suspicion. Rosa froze. She turned to face the voice. It was a uniformed officer, his posture rigid, eyes scanning her as if trying to find something wrong with her just by looking. She didn't know why he was speaking to her, but she sensed the unease in the air. "I'm driving it, officer," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with confusion. She had never been approached like this before. Not in this park, and certainly not while parked in her own vehicle. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me. I don't believe this car belongs to you." Rosa's heart sank. The car was an older model, a luxury sedan, but she had worked hard to afford it. It was hers, bought with her own money. Yet, here he was, standing over her as if she were a criminal. "Officer, I can show you my papers," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I have all the documents right here." But he wasn't listening. His bias, fueled by his own prejudices, overpowered any semblance of rational thought. His fingers gripped the door handle, pulling it open with a jerk. "Get out of the car," he barked, his tone laced with contempt. Rosa hesitated. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She was an upstanding member of the community, someone who had worked her way up through hard work and perseverance. But this officer saw only what he wanted to see, a woman who didn't belong in a car like this, a woman who he couldn't accept as someone worthy of such luxury. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice firm, though a lump was forming in her throat. "I'm not getting out until you show me your reason." The officer didn't like being defied. His patience had worn thin. He reached into the car, roughly grabbing her by the arm and pulling her out. The force made her stumble, her feet catching unevenly on the asphalt. She fell to the ground, her hand instinctively clutching her pregnant belly. Gasps of shock rose from the onlookers who had gathered in the park, their faces filled with disbelief. No one dared to intervene, but the murmurs began immediately, spreading like wildfire. The officer didn't seem to care. His only focus was on getting her out of the car, and once she was on the ground, he called to another officer, who got into the car and drove it away, leaving Rosa behind without another word. She sat there on the pavement for a moment, stunned, her knees weak from the fall, her breath short with the sudden shock of it all. There was no apology, no explanation, only the harsh weight of injustice. With a shaky breath, Rosa rose to her feet. The park felt eerily quiet now, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. She could barely believe what had occurred. She had been left stranded, forced to walk a mile to the nearest bus stop, all because a racist officer had decided she didn't belong in the car she drove. As she walked, her mind raced. This wasn't just about the car or her being pregnant. This was about something much deeper, something that had been festering in this town for years, something Rosa had always hoped would stay hidden, buried beneath the surface. But it was clear now that it wasn't going to stay hidden any longer. When she finally made it to the bus stop, she was exhausted, her feet sore, and her spirit shaken, but she held her head high. She knew what she had to do next. She wouldn't let this injustice slide. Unbeknownst to the officer who had humiliated her, Rosa was the wife of a high-ranking police chief, a fact that the officer didn't know when he made his reckless decision. Her husband, Samuel, had always supported Rosa's efforts in the community, and she had always kept a low profile, until now. The officer's actions would have consequences far beyond what he could ever imagine. Within days, the story of the incident spread throughout the town, gaining attention in the local media. Rosa, with her husband's support, pressed charges against the officer. And a hearing was scheduled. The officer's racist actions, his lack of professionalism, and his refusal to listen to reason came under intense scrutiny. His prejudice was exposed for all to see, and the community, which had once turned a blind eye to these kinds of incidents, began to take notice. The officer was eventually fired. His actions were deemed not just a violation of procedure, but a betrayal of the trust the community had placed in him as a protector of the law. The town was left to reflect on what had happened, and Rosa became a symbol of courage, standing up not only for herself but for all those who had been unjustly judged because of their race, gender, or background. It was a painful journey, but it was one that Rosa walked with grace. In the end, she knew the most important lesson wasn't in the revenge or the punishment, but in the quiet strength it took to face the injustice head-on and demand that it never happen again. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and legal proceedings. Rosa had become a quiet but steady force in the fight for justice, her once private life now the subject of public discussion. Her husband, Chief Samuel, stood by her, offering his support in every way he could. The media attention, while uncomfortable at first, started to shift in her favor as the truth about the officer's actions came to light. At first, the thought of being thrust into the spotlight unsettled Rosa. She had always enjoyed her peaceful walks through the park, the quiet conversations with friends, and the simple act of catching her breath in the open air. But now, every day felt like a constant reminder of the incident. The news was everywhere. It was on the front page of newspapers. It was trending on social media. Yet, as the hearings progressed and the public outcry grew, there was a sense of justice in the air. The officer who had made the false accusations and stripped Rosa of her dignity was swiftly removed from the force. His actions had not only violated her rights but also betrayed the very community he was supposed to protect. She stepped out of the car, her hand gently resting on her rounded belly. The cool evening air brushed against her skin as she made her way toward the familiar spot where she would sit and catch her breath. Her friends were already there, some chatting and others sipping on drinks. As she approached, they smiled at her, some with knowing glances, others with a soft look of support. "How are you feeling?" one of them asked, a woman named Emily who had been one of Rosa's closest friends for years. Emily had followed the entire ordeal from the beginning, offering her support even when Rosa had kept her distance. "I'm okay," Rosa replied with a small smile, easing herself onto the bench. "Tired, but okay." The group chatted for a while, the conversation flowing easily, just as it had before. The small circle of friends had continued to gather here every evening, just as they always had, and now, despite everything, it felt like normalcy was returning. The park was once again a place where Rosa could find comfort and peace, without the weight of prejudice hanging over her every step, but in the back of her mind, Rosa knew that she couldn't take her freedom or her safety for granted anymore. The world had changed, and she had changed with it. Still, there was something incredibly grounding about this moment, about sitting in the park, watching the sun dip below the horizon. And knowing that she had done something important, something that would matter long after the headlines faded. As she looked around, she saw a few familiar faces, people who had witnessed the entire scene and had stood by her in the aftermath. There was a quiet unity among them, a feeling of solidarity that came from shared experience, even if it wasn't always spoken aloud. One of the park regulars, an elderly man named Harold, who often spent his evenings feeding the ducks at the pond, approached her with a soft smile. "You know, I've been watching the news," he said with a kind but weary look in his eyes. "And I wanted to say, I'm proud of you." Rosa was taken aback. She hadn't expected such words from Harold, who had always been a quiet, unassuming presence in the park. "Thank you," she replied softly, a lump forming in her throat. "That means more than you know." The evening went on without interruption. Rosa stayed longer than usual, not in the mood to rush home. Her car had been returned. The officer who had wronged her was no longer a part of the force. Her life, although forever changed, was moving forward. As she walked back to her car later that night, she felt the familiar peace of the park settle over her once again. The shadows of the day were fading, and with them, the fear and the anger that had once threatened to overshadow her every thought. The sun was setting, but tomorrow would bring a new day, a day when she could walk through the park with her head held high, knowing that she had stood up for herself, and for everyone who had ever been judged because of the color of their skin. Rosa climbed into her car, started the engine, and drove home, her mind filled with quiet resolve. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The park would always be there for her, just as it always had been. And for now, that was enough. If you found Rosa's story inspiring, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more powerful stories like this. Comment below and let us know your thoughts. Have you ever stood up against injustice? We'd love to hear from you. And make sure to press the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.